Welcome back to another episode of Jay Hunto's Garage. We're doing some wiring modifications to the harness, which is the Camaro harness in my L67 swap in my 97 Camaro. The goal in this video is to lengthen the connection from the harness to the coil pack. The coil pack is normally situated back on the right side, just on top of the valve cover back there. You see kind of where that connector is sitting, but since on the L67 engine, which is front wheel drive, the coil pack is mounted to the front of the engine, so I think that's a pretty good spot to have this. Since the supercharger's in a way, we have to relocate it to the front, and that is going to involve lengthening the harness a good 14 to 16 inches. The donor harness that I have is going to need some wires lengthened on it. I'm trying to go with the longest wire and then making the shorter ones that length, so I ended up having to add a good 4 inches or so to the shorter wires to get them all close to the same length. And I'm using the set of wire strippers that are absolutely wonderful. You can adjust these wire strippers with that gold knob there depending on the thickness or gauge of your wire. So this is the length I want here, so I'm going to extend these all, I don't know, 3 inches or so, and go ahead and tin those and solder them. To extend these wires, I'm going to use the wires off of this other harness and just cut off about 3 inches of each and add them on the color that they should be continuous with. This is where I'm going to go ahead and check out this new Weller soldering iron. I got some heat shrink tubing, but unfortunately this roll of heat shrink tubing was too big. It's too big around, and it would not make a good seal around the wires. So you'll see later on I ended up getting some new some new heat shrink tubing that is the proper size and fit. So these wires, I'm just putting on some flux, taking off the insulation, just preparing for soldering. So I'm going to go ahead and get the wire nice and hot and melt the solder right in there. And then this is called tinning. So basically when you get the wire tinned, I guess you would call it, 2 wires, solder on both, then when you put them together the solder just melts together and you have a positive connection. That's the best way I know of doing this. Now they also make some that come with heat shrink on it, solder inside of it and everything, and you basically put the 2 wires into this connector, kind of looks like a butt connector, heat it up with a heat gun, and it does everything for you. That's pretty slick. I don't have any of those, but I might try those out in the future. It's a good idea to use this heat shrink tubing. The purpose of it is to provide insulation over your bare wire connection and also some weather protection, which butt connectors cannot do. So if you're going to do any kind of wiring, modifications to your harness, you definitely want to use heat shrink tubing. Here I'm trying to find a piece that fits correctly around the connection, just because if it's too big you'll never shrink it down enough. So these come in all different assorted sizes, usually by color, but not always. In this case, this light blue piece is pretty close, and I'm trying to use up all of my heat shrink tubing that I've had for years just sitting around the box. This piece fits pretty good. The heat shrink tubing, and normally you don't, if you don't do this a whole lot, you'll buy some and then you'll have it sitting around for years. So it's good to buy it in small quantities. This piece is barely small enough. I'm really not too happy with the fit, so I'm trying to get it to shrink down as much as it possibly can. I did go buy a assortment of sizes. They all come in black, which is fine. And of course, when you put heat on something, first thing you have to do afterwards is touch it with your fingers. So I checked that box off for the day. And now we're back to tinning all of these wires in preparation for soldering the new length on, and eventually getting this into the engine, in which case I'll be soldering inside of the engine bay. Again, one wire at a time. That's the only way you can really do this and decrease your likelihood of mistakes or disaster in some cases if you get the wrong wires in the wrong place. So just take it slow. I'm trying to get my mindset was to connect the correct color, so I'd be extending a green wire with a green wire, but that didn't end up working out right. Apparently through different years they change colors. So I got some, that's what happens when you go to the junkyard and you start cutting out wiring harnesses. You end up with different colors. So the main goal is to make sure that the wire on the connector is the same color as the wire on the harness that you're connecting it to, and try not to pay attention to the wire when it changes color. So this is a long, boring, tedious section, so I went ahead and sped it up. And I tell you, I really like this soldering gun from Weller. It's got a couple lights in the front. It comes with a few tips. This tip, however, I don't know the proper name of it, but it didn't last very long. I soldered all of these wires, and then when I was going to go solder in the engine compartment, the tip broke. So I don't know if I did something wrong or if it just doesn't last that long. I did end up changing the tip for a different tip that had like more of a surface area right at the end, because you can see the black right there. That's exactly where it broke. So I'm not sure. I'll have to look into that, but just be aware of that if you happen to get this type. If you know why, go ahead and add in the comments why you think that happened, or how you can avoid that from happening when soldering, because this gun was brand new right out of the box, and I didn't really think it should have broke that soon. But eventually I did get it all done, and the soldering iron performed great. Soldering gun, rather. Speaking of soldering irons, I threw away my soldering iron I've had for probably 20 years just because I had this. And I do enough soldering to have an old soldering iron laying around for 20 years. So I went ahead and bit the bullet and got this one, got rid of the old one, and I couldn't be happier with it, honestly. And the flux I'm using down there in the little plastic container, that's probably 20 years old. I kept a lot of leftovers from when my grandfather passed. And I got his toolbox and basically anything I wanted out of his tool collection and whatnot. And I've got another video regarding that toolbox, how old it is, and yeah, it's not in great shape. It's just an old Craftsman toolbox, and ever since I've moved to Texas, the darn thing has started corroding, which I think is really weird since I moved from Florida and it didn't have a lick of rust on it then. So I'll probably end up replacing that at some point. And you can see here this heat shrink tubing is just not big enough, or not small enough rather. So I went ahead and put a couple of pieces of smaller heat shrink on either side of it just to seal off the ends. It works okay. It's alright. I couldn't see doing this without heat shrink, honestly. This was all butt connectors, which at one point in time I might have done back in my 20s, and just because that was soldering was reserved for aircraft, which I worked on at the time. And if you're working on a car, you just use butt connectors. It was quick, it was fast, and didn't need the overkill of effort applied, so it was just a piece of cake. But in modern cars nowadays, with computer controlled engine management systems and whatnot, you've got to solder. I don't think I could ever do this without soldering and have any hope of it coming out right. So here over in the engine bay, this is where I'm going to have to cut each wire individually one by one from the old connector you see back there, which is kind of damaged. It's even got some RTV on it, and just needs to be replaced anyway. So you can see the connector has a keyway on the bottom of it. That's what I'm going to use to line up the or just get both connectors in the same configuration, just like this. And then I'll start from one end. I'm going to start actually from the right side and work to the left. So the wire that appears to be pink or red, it's actually white. So I'll start with that one and then just cut it, tin both ends, put on some heat shrink, and then solder it. And that's the white wire back there on the original connector. And we'll just do these all one at a time and see if we can't get this thing to work right, and not too worried about them all bunching up because they're relatively small, and we've got something to take care of that. So I'm starting the tinning process with the soldering iron and the solder, and just basically getting the wires nice and hot, getting some solder melted on them. The flux is to clean the it's almost like a primer, honestly, for the solder. Cleans everything off, make sure the solder can flow where it should. Now these aren't all exactly the same length, which is kind of what I was going for, because I want to stagger these a little bit so I'm not ending up with a big old clump of wires right there in the end, right there together. But it'll be somewhat clumpy, but it'll be okay. Here's my Dorman heat shrink tubing. This has an assortment, if you can get it open, of sizes. Much better than the one I already had. So it looks like I'll be using this size or possibly this size. Anyway, gonna use something that fits. Every wire has heat shrink tubing. So now I'm gonna go ahead and start cutting wires off of the connector one at a time. I'm gonna cut one off, solder it, and heat shrink it. Just go one at a time, making sure I've got this keyway here oriented correctly, which I do. That one is on the bottom. And the first wire I'm going to do is a white one, which on this is white, but boy, it looks pink. It looks like it used to be white at one time, so we're going to start with that one. Diagonal cutters, they were my grandfather's. Still sharp, still work. All of them. Now that is all of them. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because I've got to get this harness around the EGR valve, which is direct plumbing from the exhaust header. So that's going to be hot and right up against the shock tower, so I didn't think that was a good idea. So what I did was turned the coil pack plate, the plate that holds all these three coils, around 180 degrees and faced the receptacle for the connector up towards the supercharger. So I'm putting in all the, I don't know if this is going to work or not, putting all the screws back in. I'm missing one. These cars came with two different size screws. Of course, I only have 5 of the tiny headed screws, which is, I don't know, 5.5 millimeters, if even that. And I've got a whole bunch of the others that are larger size that actually came on the Camaro, which are probably 5/16 or 8 millimeters, something like that. But all in all, I think this is going to work. It's going to be a little different than anyone else's swapped car, that's for sure. But I got this in to fit fine, and I'm pretty happy with that. Zip ties help. The plastic wrap, the loom wrap, helps make it look factory, keep water off of it. It looks nicer, and helps clean things up a little bit. The next thing I've got to do is extend the wires for the starter motor, the knock sensor on the passenger side, and also the transmission plug. So that's going to be something else, because there's quite a few wires in it, maybe even more than this one's got. More to come. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching.